creative journey. It's easy to get lost, but don't worry, you'll lift off. Sometimes you just need a creative pep talk.
Hey, you're listening to the Creative Pep Talk podcast. My name's Andy J. Pizza. I am your host. Today on the show, it's kind of like Creative Pep Talk Unplugged. Remember that? Like back in the day, Nirvana Unplugged? Man, best Nirvana album in my opinion. Is that controversial? I don't know. I don't know Nirvana fans or what have you. But today we're going to talk about how do you have fans like Nirvana had? How do you have people that really are invested and care about what you do? You know, I just feel often like you feel like you've got some magic beans on your hands as a creator, but everyone else just thinks it's, you know, they don't feel as passionate about the dog in that Bush's Baked Beans commercial. They're not wanting to roll that beautiful bean footage. They're not even watching your reels or TikToks or your Instagram posts. Like, they're like, keep your beans to yourself. Today, we're going to talk about what do you do with that big pile of beans? What do you do with that magic that you feel inside and that you feel is in your work? How do you actually make it so that anybody else cares about it? We're going to talk about that by answering two different questions that are kind of related in a special edition of Ask Dr. Pizza Unplugged. I don't know if that's really true. It's a Q&A episode, but I'm really pumped about where these questions went and some of the answers that we explore. But first, a little word from our sponsors. There's nothing better than getting better. Accomplishing growth is extremely satisfying, and online classes from Skillshare make it possible. Learn about illustration, design, photography, productivity, and marketing with shill scares. I always say shill scare right around Halloween. We just had Halloween, so I'm a little late, but shill scare. That's the scary alter ego of Skillshare. But Skillshare is not scary. It makes learning accessible with short classes. You can move your creative journey forward without putting your life on hold. Halfway through this episode, I'm going to tell you about a class me and my daughter were checking out. Productivity for students. Study smarter, not harder. Some interesting things about this, even if you're not in school. We'll get to that later. But for now, you can go sign up to a premium membership for free with your trial. Skillshare.com/creativepep. We are going to shout out the sponsors, but since this is unplugged, I don't really know that it is unplugged, but since it is, I just felt like saying, hey, I hope that y'all notice that we spend a lot of time and energy having products and sponsors that we believe in and feel are appropriate and relevant to the people listening. So you better pay attention, you guys, because we're trying really hard to have great partners. One of the great partners we have is Adobe Wireframe Podcast. This show is for small business owners who handle all the branding, content, and design of their business. You probably make your own website and your own posts and all that stuff. Like that's me. And so it's probably you too. And I've just found over the years, like, getting to know the business side is a creative problem that can be really fun and really rewarding when you do it right. And every episode, they have designer and a business owner who have an insight. I love those juicy nuggets. Oh man, those are organic nuggets of juicy gold. And I love stuff like that. I'm a sucker for it. If you listen to the show, you probably are too, because that's what I try to build this show around, is like really good particulars, ideas that are actionable, things you haven't thought of. That's what this show is all about. That's what Wireframe Podcast is all about. You can go find it on any podcast player, Adobe's Podcast Wireframe, and I'm going to put a link in the show notes. And then halfway through the episode, I'm going to tell you about an episode that is relevant to the stuff we're talking about, really relevant to this episode.
Dr. Pizza, a fellow neurodivergent ADHD creative here, and I have a question about series. So I desperately want to make a series. I have about 3 different ideas in my mind about series that I want to do, and I'm really excited by them. But I struggle to maintain the gusto or even the grit to do another piece after I've made one for the quote unquote series. And so I am a collage artist, and I'm making all these random one-off pieces that don't necessarily connect to each other in any way, which is fine and great. But I want to make a series, but by the time I finish one, I'm like totally bored by it and I don't want to do it anymore. And I guess I'm just looking for maybe some tips or suggestions on how to maintain the energy to want to do a series or the interest level, because with ADHD, as you know, it's just like once I'm done, I'm done. And it's not interesting anymore. The super sparkly shiny is gone. So please help me make a series because I really want to do one. I have several in the bank. I just can't keep it going.
Okay, so there's 2 things that I want to respond with on when you want to do a series, but you're not able to create more than one piece of work. There's kind of 2 different things that may be at play that may help you. The first one is, we're going to talk about the medium of your choice when it comes to a creative idea. Like, how do you express a thing? Most creators have multiple ways to express things. For me, I have very distinct different ones. So it could be a kid's book, it could be a podcast, it could be an Instagram post, all these different things. And we're going to talk about the different mediums and how to think about what the idea wants to be. And then the second thing we're going to talk about is motivation style. So if you're losing motivation, there might be some insight in understanding your particular motivation style, especially as someone with ADHD. Okay, so there's 2 kind of pieces. The first piece is this idea of cups. We've talked about this on the show before, but it's an idea that I'm revisiting all the time, and I'm always finding new pieces to. One of the pieces that I recently ran into was in discussing a possible book project with an editor at a publisher. She told me, she's like, sometimes when she gets pitched a book and it's a series of photography or it's a series of essays or what have you, she has to decide, like, does this content fit into the cup that is a book, the container that is a book? Because I was saying, hey, I've tried to explore this thing on the podcast, or I've done a podcast series about that. And she was like, okay, well, let's first just talk about why this needs to be executed in a book format when it's already been in the cup of a podcast. I think a lot of times when it comes to our creative work, we think that if you think about it like a wine in a wine glass, we think the wine glass is the creative essence. We think of the things that we create. Let's say we create paintings. Let's say we create songs. Let's say we create podcasts. We create books, whatever it is. We see ourselves as defined by those pieces of work and how they are manifested. The what of what we make. Like, what do you make? I make picture books. I'm a picture book maker. But the truth is, there's something deeper than that. All of those things, books, podcasts, songs, those are all containers for different creative urges or creative impulses or ideas. When you're writing a song, there's a lot of different creative things happening there. There is the urge to communicate. So, before you're a songwriter, you're a communicator. Maybe you're a storyteller before you're a kid's book maker or a songwriter. Like what is the deeper thing happening? And I think it's interesting even as a topic of like people that approach songs completely differently. Like Bob Dylan is not the same thing as, let's say, Drake, okay? Which is a funny comparison, but it's true. Like what Drake does is a completely different thing. Same cup, technically, a song, same glass, but what they're pouring into that glass is dramatically different. And I think it's important to identify more with the approach than the container. And then you can do interesting things. And the reason I bring this up is because it sounds like there's a mismatch to your approach and your container. That's my first guess, is that when you feel incredibly enthusiastic about an idea, it feels so important and so massive to you that you feel like it must manifest through the lens of multiple pieces, a body of work. Whereas when you go execute that one piece of work, it feels like, oh, there it is. That I didn't need to be that. And I've heard Liz Gilbert talk about, like the author of Eat, Pray, Love and Big Magic, how you have to find out what does the idea want to be, like it has its own will and desires. And I think she even recommends, like, what's the smallest thing you could make with that? And then once you make it, just ask the idea, like, is that good enough? Like, did you, and in the next question, I'm going to talk even more about this idea that this huge passion that you have, the whole idea of art is that you would filter it and channel it and craft it and work it into something much smaller and much more potent, like an espresso. And so you feel like, look, you're looking at the coffee beans, right? And you're like, man, look at these. There's a whole pile of coffee beans here. But your job as the artist is to grind those beans, get them down to this fine concentrate. And that huge passion that you have, which feels like a series in size, by the time you serve it, it's just one piece of work. It's just one little tiny, super potent thing. That is the creative process. We're going to talk about that in chapter 3, the last piece. But that might be what's going on, is that the execution, the passion feels so big that you're like, it has to equal the size of the output, when in fact, that's not the case. The job is to filter it down, concentrate it, because the people that are interacting with this need that thing to be accessible. They need it to be digestible. They need it to be able to be consumed quickly so that they understand like what you're on about without just giving you all of their extra time. Like we're not entitled to people's time to pay attention to our eccentric interests. You know what I mean? That's why we filter this thing down. But the first thing might be the cup, the wine and the wine glass aren't fitting. The beans to the espresso, there's kind of a lost in translation there. So maybe it just doesn't need to be series. Like, why are you putting the need for this to be a series? Is it just because it feels so big to you? Well, just understand that the whole idea is to get it down to a fine concentrate. But the other thing I want to add, just on this topic of cups while we're here, I want to just mention that I think a lot about how the wine and the wine glass are fit together. And if you've ever drank wine out of a different, like a coffee mug, there are scenarios where that can be awful, that mismatch, but there are also scenarios where it can be incredible, because there's this thing where you have a red solo cup full of wine and you're drinking it on the rooftop of an old church, and all of a sudden the mismatch creates a scenario where it's a memory you'll never forget in your life because it was so peculiar. And so I would say, I just want to highlight, and then this segues into the second thing I want to say. I just want to highlight that the mismatch can be on purpose and can be really interesting. You know, the idea that Bob Dylan would tell these giant stories through the lens of a song is a kind of mismatch wine and mug scenario, because songs aren't the first place storytellers usually go. But that has to do with, maybe guitar and you're not as great writing prose, or you don't want to draw pictures for picture books, or whatever that might be. There's really interesting things that can happen. Like, I feel like I shoehorn a lot of different particular approaches to creativity that are uncommon in the kind of circles where I do talks at conferences and schools, etc. I'm bringing a lot of different tools and intents to that cup that are a mismatch fit. But then if you do it intentionally, if I'm breaking the expectations, you can do so without it being a negative sort of surprise. And that also goes into this idea of the mismatch. There might be a rebellious spirit to your approach as an ADHD creator, but also into how you want people to feel about your work. Maybe the type of work you like to consume is kind of like drinking out of a fire hose. As a ADHD person myself who is always in need of extreme stimulation, you might see me out there taking a handful of Altoids and eating them all at once. Like, that's how I get down, because I need that punch in the face to get that dopamine surge. Like, I like that kind of thing. And I like art like that, maximalist stuff sometimes that just smashes you over the head with it. Fast-paced, intense, loud, weird, grating, all these different things. Like, I like a lot of maximalist stuff for that reason. And so maybe you're just the type of creator that wants to mismatch in the way of, look, this should be a series, but I'm boiling it down to one piece of incredibly intense work that assaults the senses, right? Like, that might be your style, and that's cool too. And on this topic of being a rebel, I find that, I don't just find this, I've learned and I've read about how, especially in kids, ADHD can often go hand in hand and be comorbid with oppositional defiant disorder, ODD. And that's just this thing of, if you tell me to do this, I'm going to do the opposite. Except we have this as a kind of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde scenario just as often as we're trying to rebel against others. We're trying to rebel against the part of us that's trying to control us. And so as soon as you say, I'm going to do this every week, or I'm going to turn this into a series, all of a sudden your inner rebel is like, no, you're not. You can't tell me what to do. And so there's this kind of thing that happens. One thing I would recommend is checking out The Four Tendencies by Gretchen Rubin and understanding how your motivation works, because we're all motivated by different things. Just a quick little rundown. There's four tendencies. There's upholders, questioners, obligers, and rebels. Upholders are the people that want to meet all the expectations, and they want to meet their internal expectations and their external expectations of others, and they want to do everything by the book. Questioners, which I would probably put myself in this category, are people who are like, I just need to know why. Why are we doing this? I am not going to meet your external expectations if they don't meet my own internal expectations. And the best way I think about this is if it comes to learning an instrument. If I was ever learning guitar and you told me, hey, we need to learn these 3 chords, I'd be like, why? Why are we doing this? I can't just do it because you told me to. I need to know what is my motivation. And if it's like, hey, I wanted to learn this song by Neutral Milk Hotel, so I need to learn these 4 chords, and now I understand. So I'm going to question until I understand what's the purpose of that. Once I understand the why, I can withstand almost any how. That's a Nietzsche quote. Obligers are people that can't meet their own internal expectations. Like them giving themselves a rule and saying, hey, I'm going to do this personal project every single week isn't enough. They need somebody else, a partner, a studio mate, someone in on it with them that is going to hold them accountable. They need some kind of external expectation. It's the kind of person that says, hey, I'm going to sign up for this fitness class and where you have to pay in advance for 6 months. And the fact that I've paid and I'm going there means I have this external obligation that's going to get me moving. And then last but not least is rebel. And they are people that are driven by doing the opposite of the external and internal expectations. And I feel like a lot of creators and a lot of ADHD people fit into this category. And I think what is really helpful is to remember, like, there are different ways to approach this kind of motivation than saying, this is a rule, you have to do this. And it might mean for you looking at, like, when you think, hey, this might be a series, you tell your internal self, like, let's see how it feels. Let's do one, just like Liz Gilbert talked about, and just say, okay, idea. And instead of letting yourself determine it, or letting an external expectation determine it, give all the power over to the idea. You might be that type of creator that needs to give the idea the full license and say, maybe I suspect it's going to be a series, but look, I won't know until I've made it. And we'll just see. We'll just see after I do it. And even if you approach the last pieces that way, you might have been able to turn them into a series because that rebellious spirit wasn't invoked to push against the internal, external expectations. And I've even heard Marie Forleo, who is in the business space, talk about this interesting idea that there is research into if you say, I should or I can't do those things, you are less likely to follow through than if you say, I don't. And the example is something like, I can't eat that chocolate cake because it's a weekday and I can't eat chocolate cake on a weekday because that's a rule that I set for myself. Instead of saying, I don't eat chocolate cake on a weekday. I've even found if I just change that language in my head, I'm less likely to invoke that rebel spirit that says, you can't tell me what to do. I eat chocolate cake whenever I want it, right? Like, I don't know why, but I have some of that going for me too. And so I have to be like, I do or don't do these things. Like I'm just doing it, or I'm not doing it, but not I can't or I shouldn't. Those things invoke that spirit. So as you're going about it, I think it really just comes down to understanding how do the inner mechanisms of your motivation and decisions work, which will also mean diving deep into the neurodivergent brain of an ADHD person and understanding the particulars, because it's a negotiation. And I think part of that is, it is that Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing, and realizing that Mr. Hyde isn't all bad. That part of you that wants to rebel, you just need to respect it. It's got, if you will trust that it's good and be curious about it, you might find like that it's meeting a need or it's protecting something. Like, question it and understand it and learn it. And it's just kind of like a kid, actually, too. You got to learn, how do you parent this part of you into its doing things in its best interest. And don't always assume you know. Maybe it was not right to do a series in the first place, just like all the other options we talked about. I think you got to respect that part of yourself.